This episode contains graphic content that may not be suitable for all ages. Listener discretion is advised. If you or someone you know is struggling or in crisis, help is available. Call or text 988 or chat with someone at 988lifeline.org. Those outside of the US, reach out to someone at your local crisis center or hotline. Please do not suffer in silence. For many of us, Hawaii is a place we daydream about merely visiting. A place where we save up money and vacation time throughout the year in order to splurge and lap up the sun, the beaches, the amazing food, and the laid-back culture. For some, even small vacations in Hawaii seem like an unobtainable luxury, and we envision that living there must surely be akin to paradise. The fourth largest of the Hawaiian Islands, Kauai lies 73 miles northwest of Oahu, with a permanent population of just over 73,000. Nicknamed the Garden Isle, Kauai is a place of immense natural beauty, and is one of the islands visited most by tourists from not only the mainland US, but from other nations. In addition to its beautiful scenery, Kauai is also home to incredibly fertile land, where a wide variety of crops are grown such as guava, coffee, sugarcane, mango, bananas, avocado, pineapple, the list goes on. Despite attempts by billionaires like Mark Zuckerberg to buy up land on the island for his own private use, Kauai is still home to an incredibly rich culture that perseveres to this day. Yet, as I mentioned, while many of us dream about Kauai as a paradise where problems just melt away in the surf and sand, the island is not a stranger to burdens such as violent crime. As stated by Sue Kanoho, the executive director of the Kauai Visitors Bureau, to the Los Angeles Times in 2001, Kauai is such a sweet little place that people think it's immune to the kinds of problems that plague other destinations. As we'll explore in this episode, that is not the case. This is the story of the Kauai serial killer. At around 2 p.m. on Friday, April 7th, 2000, the body of a woman was discovered near Polehale State Park by two fishermen. The fishermen discovered the woman's partially nude body in a ditch beside a Cane Hall Road leading to the park, and immediately notified an employee of the nearby Amfac sugar plantation, who then contacted police. At the scene, police noted that the victim was a Caucasian woman in her 30s or 40s who had evidently only been there a short time, as decomposition was yet to fully set in. Standing approximately 5 feet 2 inches tall and described as very slim, the woman had medium-length brown hair and no identification on her at the time. Officers would begin the process of trying to determine her identity, but knew immediately that she had died a violent death, labeling her a victim of homicide at the scene. Within a day, investigators were able to put a name to the woman whose body they had found. 38-year-old Lisa Bel, who had no permanent address or place of employment, but was known to frequent several towns along Kauai's west side, including Waimea, where she was well known. After learning a bit about her, police began describing her as partially homeless, and surprisingly discovered that she was married but did not live with her husband. Rather, she seemed to float among a rotating cast of friends, and was known to hitchhike quite frequently. Police found witnesses that put her in nearby Honapepe, presumably headed to Waimea, just a day before her body was found, on April 6th. As I mentioned, Lisa Bel had died a violent death. An autopsy of her remains discovered that her killer had used a knife to stab Lisa and slash her throat, but had beaten and raped her beforehand. Yet it was not believed that the wounds to her throat had immediately killed her. Rather, she had been stabbed and then dumped, left to bleed out in the ditch where her body was later found. There was also evidence that she had had some sexual contact with someone before her death, yet coroners were unable to determine if it had been consensual or not. Based on the circumstances of her death, however, investigators felt comfortable surmising that it had not been consensual. It was believed that Lisa's body had been in that ditch roughly halfway between Polehale Beach Park and the nearby Kamali'i Highway for less than 12 hours. Because of this strange location, it was believed that she had been assaulted and killed in a separate location and then dumped. To that end, authorities discovered some of her belongings alongside a road in Waimea and would theorize that's where she had been abducted. Authorities hoped that anyone with information would tell police details about her final day alive. Where she had been, whom she had seen, what she had been wearing, where she might have been heading, etc. They would interview those close to Lisa, including her estranged husband, and investigators would develop several suspects as a result. One such suspect had items from their vehicle seized by police to scan for evidence, but updates in Lisa's case would become more and more rare as days turned into weeks. Roughly a month and a half later, on Tuesday, May 22, 2000, a 52-year-old woman was working at an unoccupied home in Kekaha along the Kamali'i Highway. This was a home with a walled garden, covered in all kinds of vegetation, and the woman, who was house-sitting for her friends, was working in the vast garden that early evening. At some point between 6 and 7 p.m., this woman was approached by a man who she believed to be homeless. Mainly because he approached her, saying, "My name is John, and I'm homeless." For that reason, the woman directed the man towards one of the neighbors' homes, since they were known to be friendly to the unhoused and occasionally offered to let them camp in their yard. She then turned her back and began tending to her work again, but was then assaulted by the unknown man, who picked her up and carried her behind the home, away from any potential witnesses. There, behind the home, this woman was then beaten quite severely, to the point that one of her arms was broken and both of her retinas were detached. She was then sexually assaulted. As this carried on, the man then presented a knife that he had been carrying, stabbing it into the woman's chest, where it hit her breastbone and then bent. This caused the offender to curse out, fleeing shortly thereafter, and then throwing the knife into the nearby bushes. The attacker likely believed the woman to be dead as he fled the scene, but little did he know, she still drew breath. This woman would begin to crawl on the ground for what felt like an eternity. In actuality, it was approximately 3 hours. She then made it to a telephone where she could call for help. Thankfully, the offender did not return, and thankfully this woman would survive this harrowing ordeal, although I'm sure her path to recovery was no easy feat. During her recovery, this woman would speak to investigators and provide them with a description of her attacker, which was passed along to reporters as a 200-pound local male, 6 feet to 6 feet 3. After cooperating with authorities, this woman would return to the mainland to recover alongside her family, and unfortunately her cooperation did not lead to any resolution in her case, or in the case of the next victim to follow. More than 3 months later, on August 30th, 2000, a decomposing female body was found at a remote campsite near Pakala Point Beach. As investigators would later disclose, the homicide victim was believed to have been dead for at least 12 hours before her partially clad remains were discovered at approximately noon that Wednesday by a surfer. Like the other victims, this woman had been brutally beaten and sexually assaulted, having endured not only a vicious attack and a rape, but having been stabbed in the throat afterward. A considerable amount of blood was discovered at the crime scene, which was a makeshift campsite just off of the beach in a wooded area nearby. Despite being beaten to the point where her face was unrecognizable, an ID found at the scene told police exactly who this woman was and where she came from. Darren Singer was a 43-year-old from Maui who was described as sweet by those that knew her. A close friend told reporters with the Honolulu Star Bulletin, "She was giving. She was a Krishna devotee." Described by another friend as a very spiritual person that cared a lot about people, Darren Singer had worked as a jewelry maker for many years. She lived in Maui but was known to visit Kauai regularly for various shells, which she then turned into pieces of jewelry. The ID that Darren Singer carried at the time was an expired driver's license from 1995, which listed a post office box in Maui as her address. However, as police would learn, Darren Singer lived a very nomadic, bohemian lifestyle. At the time of her death, she had been camping near Pakala Point Beach, which was one of Kauai's best surfing sites, but not a widely known one. Rather, it was a bit of a well-kept secret by locals, which was accessible only via trails. A journal she had kept revealed that she had been there since Monday, just a day or two before her death, and she had likely been alone. She had slung up a hammock between trees and had a few items there, including a surfboard. She had also kept cash, which was there at the crime scene, indicating this hadn't been a robbery. She had been camping incognito, since this was technically private property owned by the company Gay & Robinson, and camping there was prohibited. For that reason, authorities were not sure if anyone had seen or interacted with her there, but they wanted to know if anyone had. From the jump, Darren Singer's death was declared a confirmed homicide by investigators, who noted that she had fought back against her attacker. She had defensive wounds all over her hands, and the specific details of the beating indicated that her offender had extensively brutalized her. Her clothing had been partially torn off, and it was confirmed through an autopsy that she had been sexually assaulted. A memorial service for Darren Singer was held the next month, and was attended by more than 500 people, who all came to pay their respects to a woman that had been nothing but nice to all of them. In the many weeks between these three crimes, Kauai police held several community meetings to talk to and hear from locals, where they discovered that many were beginning to feel unsafe. The communities in Kauai were pretty small and close-knit, so hearing about these three crimes over just a handful of months made many fear that their wives, their daughters, their sisters, their mothers, or even themselves could be next. A woman from Waimea told reporters with the Honolulu Star-Bulletin, "Nothing like this has ever happened here before. I'm locking my doors now, something I never did in my whole life." This was actually a fear shared by many residents of Kauai who had little reason to fear before this. The island had never seen a killer of this type. In fact, before the murder of Lisa Bel, Kauai had not seen a homicide in more than 2.5 years, and most prior crimes typically involved drug dealers or domestic disputes. Almost none involved random attacks on strangers like this. For that reason, the entire island of Kauai did not have traditional homicide detectives. Rather, they had an investigations department which handled all crime, violent and non-violent. And for them, this was the first potential serial killer they had ever pursued. Inspector Mel Morris, who headed Kauai's investigations department, told reporters, "In my career, this is the first time we've had a string of homicides like this." We'll be back in just a moment. Following the murder of Lisa Bel back in April of 2000, Kauai police had developed a pool of suspects. Over months, however, none had panned out. When a woman was attacked just weeks later in May, authorities struggled to determine whether her case was connected to the first or not. There were many similarities, but there were also many differences. Primarily because the victim lived, but there had also been no dumping of her remains. She had been stabbed in the chest, not the neck. It had seemed like more of a random attack than a targeted killing. It just seemed bizarre. But following the discovery of Darren Singer's remains in August of 2000, authorities began to theorize that all three crimes were linked. All had taken place within the same general area, along the southwestern coast of Kauai, within 2 or so miles of each other. All three were alone at the time of their initial assault, and each was a middle-aged Caucasian woman with the same general characteristics. They were short with a slight build and lighter-colored hair. For reference, all three were between 5'2" and 5'5" and weighed approximately 100 pounds. All three were beaten and sexually assaulted, and the offender used a knife to stab them. As I mentioned though, the 2 deceased victims had been stabbed in the throat, while the surviving victim was stabbed in the sternum. What's more is that the time frame for the 3 crimes was pretty tight. The first crime took place in April and was followed by the second attack in May, where the victim survived. Maybe after that the attacker caught cold feet, worried that he would fail again or get caught, but couldn't stay his impulses for much longer, lashing out at a third victim in August. Per Kauai Police Chief George Freitas to reporters.
We have now since April 3 violent crimes, all sexual in nature, and the victims seem to fit the same profile, even the same physical characteristics to each other. My speculation is there may be one person who committed all 3 of these crimes.
Despite police linking these 3 cases together through their glaring similarities, however, they did not believe that only women matching this description were in danger. Rather, these all seemed to be victims of opportunity who just so happened to share many physical characteristics. But there was no telling whether or not they matched a type, or whether they were just more readily available for the killer to target. Per Chief Freitas.
Those things may not be the key at all. The key may simply be vulnerability. One person alone in an isolated spot at an odd hour becomes someone who is potentially vulnerable.
More than 20 officers were assigned to the case early on, with evidence specialists from the Honolulu Police Department called in to assist. Helicopters were used to inspect the coastline for any potential evidence, and officers conducted door-to-door and beach-to-beach sweeps near the crime scenes to comb for anything potentially useful. It's unknown if they found anything. Weeks after Darren Singer's death, a $25,000 reward was announced by local officials, who hoped the amount might encourage witnesses to come forward. At around the same time, police speculated that there was at least one witness who saw the events leading up to and/or following the second attack, the one in which the 52-year-old unnamed victim survived. But authorities believed this person was too frightened to speak, and hoped that the heightened cash reward might encourage them to do so. It's unknown how they came to this belief, but they would hammer upon it in the press for quite a while to no avail. As authorities waited for the forensic testing of physical evidence to come through, they continued to hold out hope that this potential witness would come forward to provide information about this unknown offender. In October, a month after the second killing, Police Chief George Freitas told the Honolulu Advertiser,
"There are 2 elements. One is the tedious task of working on a series of physical evidence things. The other, we really believe that there is a witness or witnesses out there on the west side who hasn't come forward. It's very frustrating for us."
The surviving victim from May was flown out to Oahu and shown a police lineup, which was made up predominantly of suspects left over from the initial investigation into Lisa Bel's murder. Sadly though, this surviving victim's vision was still impaired from the vicious beating she had endured. As I mentioned, both of her retinas had been detached, leaving her with eyesight that was never fully restored. She was able to eliminate 2 men as perpetrators in her attack, but was unable to identify or eliminate any of the other suspects. Sadly, that left investigators essentially adrift in trying to identify this suspect, who they feared may strike again. The police chief put it best when he said that investigators could not escape the question of whether or not the killer was basically trolling the shoreline looking for victims, to which Kauai Police Chief Lieutenant Bill Ching responded,
"That's a very likely possibility."
As the investigation into this unknown killer and attacker continued, police officials overseeing it claimed that they were hoping to consult with FBI profilers to help learn some more about this offender and his habits. Despite the attack seeming to come to an end after the murder of Darren Singer in August of 2000, it was unknown if the attacker had stopped entirely. Perhaps he had relocated to the US mainland, or was otherwise biding his time. Yet, certain experts believed that he would not stop entirely of his own volition. Or rather, they believed he couldn't. Dr. Harold V. Hall, a forensic neuropsychologist, told the Honolulu Advertiser,
"There is no ending on their own with serial rape murder. These people are basically psychopathic in nature."
Dr. Hall believed that this killer likely felt little to no remorse for his actions, and that victims, or potential victims, were unlikely to be able to talk or negotiate their way out of an attack once the attacker had set his sights upon them.
A serial rapist murderer is not going to be talked out of anything. He may deceptively give the appearance that he is listening to the victim, but only to gain an advantage.
In his warning, Dr. Hall said it was important for the community to remain alert.
He may lie low for months, 6 months, or a year or two, and then strike again. Due to the nature of the beast, you need periodic public service announcements and reminders.
Surprisingly, when the FBI got involved, they asked for records of 3 separate incidents from Oahu. 2 were murder cases from the year prior, 1999, and the other was a disappearance from Kauai in October of 1999, roughly 6 months before the first murder in Kauai. In that case, the victim matched the physical description of the 3 cases from there. The 2 murders from Oahu took place in August of 1999, the year before the cases in Kauai occurred. The body of the first victim, 24-year-old Micheal Singer, was discovered on the side of a Cane Hall Road on August 10th, and was so badly decomposed at the time of discovery that her death was classified as probably homicide, and no cause of death could be determined. The remains of the second victim, 21-year-old Jubilee Lum, was stuffed in plastic garbage bags and disposed of at around the same time. She had been strangled to death. It was unknown if these 2 deaths had any correlation to the unfolding serial killer case from Kauai, but it was theorized that the FBI submitted paperwork to review them as part of a potentially larger case because it allowed immediate forensic testing. Per Honolulu PD Homicide Lieutenant Bill Cato, who told the Advertiser,
"The FBI is trying to get these cases classified as serial killings because then we can expedite some tests through their lab and we can get assistance from them. We don't see any obvious connections, but the FBI profiling people may see something that we don't."
Both of those murder cases remain unsolved to this day, so there's no telling whether or not they bear any similarities to the attacks on Kauai. The third case that I mentioned beforehand, though, the disappearance, bore some strange similarities. In that case, which took place in October of 1999, the victim was 49-year-old Melanie Ray Summers, who, it's worth noting, stood 5 feet 3 inches tall and weighed approximately 101 pounds, well within the victim type of the Kauai cases. Witnesses had seen her vehicle stuck along the side of a road in Kauai on October 13th, and she had then sought help from a nearby residence. They had directed her to a neighbor's property, where she ended up staying the night, leaving the following morning. She was last seen standing near her vehicle at around 1 p.m. that day, but disappeared shortly thereafter and was never seen alive again. To this day, she is still considered a missing person. Investigators would begin to question the roughly 70 registered sex offenders on Kauai, but many feared that this was a Hail Mary by investigators, hoping to trip up a potential suspect among those that had committed crimes against women and girls in the past. However, during these interviews, investigators seemed to have narrowed in on the only unofficially named suspect in this case, a known sex offender named Waldorf Roy Wilson II, aka Wally Wilson, whose brother, it's worth pointing out, was a KPD police officer, and a prominent one at that, serving for years on the island's Vice Squad. Wally Wilson had ended up on investigators' radar because of his prior criminal history. In August 1983, he had been convicted of a rape and kidnapping, a crime for which he was paroled in January of 1999. Months afterward, he had moved to Kauai, shortly before the killings there began. This may have just been a coincidence, but investigators feared it wasn't. The crime Wilson had been convicted of took place in October of 1982, when he was just 23 years old. The victim, a 32-year-old neighbor of his, claimed that he had not only kidnapped and raped her, but then destroyed her car afterward. In court, Wally Wilson's defense had been that he had consumed beer, marijuana, LSD, and Quaaludes beforehand, so he was simply too drunk and high to remember it taking place. He had reportedly accepted a ride home from his neighbor, who claims that he forced her to drive over into an isolated state park and then raped her. He then drove off with her car and claimed in court that he came back to his senses while driving, suddenly overcome with a feeling that he had done something terrible. Instead of trying to retrace his steps or do anything to correct his actions, he then decided to douse his neighbor's vehicle with gasoline and set it on fire. The jury in that case deliberated for a grand total of 3 hours before reaching a guilty verdict. During sentencing, the judge insisted that he serve a minimum sentence of at least 5 years because this conviction for rape, kidnapping, sexual assault, and theft came when he was already on probation for burglary, a crime that had taken place in 1980. He was later given a vague 5 to 20-year prison sentence, but released on parole in January of 1999. He then relocated to Kauai about 1 year later, in early 2000, and the crimes began shortly thereafter in April. On September 12, 2000, just 2 weeks after the body of Darren Singer was discovered, Waldorf Wilson II was arrested for violating the terms of his parole. As detailed by KHNL Channel 8 News, this only occurred because he was under investigation at the time as a suspect in the 3 crimes from Kauai, something that surprisingly both Wilson and the Kauai Police Department would deny. Police officials would insist that his arrest had nothing to do with their ongoing investigation, but it was later confirmed that his parole violation only came to light because of police's increased scrutiny of him at the time, after he had become one of their primary suspects. After Darren Singer's brutalized body was found, investigators began tailing Wilson to learn his habits, and later discovered he had been violating his parole in minor ways. 2 weeks later, Wilson was arrested for 3 parole violations: contacting a woman he was forbidden from seeing, visiting family on Oahu without notifying his parole officer, and failing to provide his parole officer a description of his vehicle, all of which were relatively minor, but were admittedly violations of his parole agreement. After this arrest for his parole violations, Wally Wilson was sent back to prison for 5 years, sentenced to be released in October of 2007. Immediately afterward, the attacks on women in Kauai came to an end, with no additional assaults or murders being linked to this same spree. However, Wilson was released on parole in January 2002, but prohibited from returning to Kauai, where he had violated the terms of his earlier release. Months after that, in June, he was deemed to have again violated his parole conditions, and sent to serve out the rest of his sentence through 2007. It's unknown what evidence investigators had linking Wally Wilson to the crime, if at all, but one news article claimed through anonymous police sources that he had been seen in the area of the second crime, the one in which the victim survived, before it had taken place. Perhaps this is why investigators had been so eager for their potential witness to come forward. Maybe they had provided information shining a light on Wilson, but then refused to put their name on it, something like that, essentially making it hearsay. If so, that would explain why police were so suspicious of Wilson, but were never able to build a prosecutable case against him. Later, Wally Wilson would sue not only several Kauai police officers, but various media outlets, including Honolulu Magazine, the Garden Island newspaper, and a couple of reporters, claiming they had harassed and defamed him with their investigation and coverage. In his lawsuit, he claimed that Kauai detectives pressured him into taking a polygraph on September 12, 2000, the same day he had been arrested for the parole violations, and had pressured the Hawaii Paroling Authority into revoking his parole to reincarcerate him. Wilson's lawsuit also claimed that his DNA had been tested against the various suspect samples left behind at the crime scenes, which police had long since described as coming back inconclusive. Wilson's attorneys argued that they weren't inconclusive, but rather conclusively proved that his client had not committed the crimes. It wasn't until 2009 that this lawsuit was ultimately dismissed. Despite what some commenters on Reddit have pointed out, Waldorf Wilson II is not deceased. They found an obituary from 2005 of a man with the same name, but that man was this Waldorf Wilson's father. His son, Waldorf II, is still alive and is on the Hawaii Sex Offenders Registry. I don't want to dox him with the hope that he's managed to turn his life around, but this is a common discrepancy that I wanted to correct. Despite being eyed as a prominent suspect in this case, Waldorf Wilson II was never charged with the attacks from Kauai. Neither was anyone else for that matter, and more than 2 decades later, the 3 crimes remain completely unsolved. More after the break. Despite police theorizing early on that these crimes were committed by a single individual, they quickly changed their tune. Inspector Mel Morris, who headed the Investigations Bureau for Kauai PD, told reporters,
"There are as many differences between the 3 cases as there are similarities. KPD has not ruled out the possibility that there may be more than one person responsible.
It is worth noting that at around the same time authorities began making statements like this, throwing cold water on their previously established theories, they were facing some increased scrutiny from Waldorf Wilson and his attorneys. So at the time Inspector Morris made these comments, police were claiming that Wilson and his arrest were unrelated to any of these cases, something that was later determined to be false. After all, it was investigators' increased scrutiny of Wilson following the murders that led to his arrest for the parole violations. It's possible that this was just an attempt by Kauai PD to distance themselves from any rumors, which were being spread anonymously by their own officers to certain reporters and journalists. This was given further credence by police quickly closing ranks at around the same time, handing off their press matters to the mayor's office. Months later, in November of 2000, it was reported that test results from the various pieces of evidence came back inconclusive, as in they did not single out any one suspect, nor did they point to any of the suspects police had developed up to that point. It also seemed like none of the DNA from the samples matched, although it's hard to tell whether that indicated multiple suspects had been involved or whether evidence had been mishandled. As you can imagine, this has led to a lot of confusion over the years as to whether or not these crimes were related, or whether they were the work of two or more attackers at around the same time. Yet, many police continue to believe that they had been the work of a single killer. Police Chief George Freitas told reporters in April of 2001,
"It is possible this is not a serial murder case, but it's hard for me to imagine that three women who appear to be in approximately the same age group, who have other similarities all within 10 miles of each other. It's hard for me to believe it's not connected."
Regardless, police had no explanation for why the attacks came to a sudden end in August of 2000.
If in fact this is a serial case, has this person moved on? Has this person become deceased? Is this person in jail? I don't know.
Sadly, despite police speaking frequently about this case in its early months, that changed as 2000 bled into 2001, and speculation began swirling around the arrest of Waldorf Wilson. From there, authorities seemed to change their tune and began making generic statements through the mayor's public information officer, who served as their press liaison from there on out. As a result, coverage of the case quickly died out, and decades later, it remains mostly forgotten about, except among some locals. For many of these locals, the fear that reverberated through their community during that time was hard to shake off. For some, it never did. Nancy Peterson, the director of family violence programs for the Kauai YMCA, told the Honolulu Advertiser in 2002,
"The violence that occurred was so horrendous, so ugly. We can never go back to being naive. It's difficult because it's been out of the news. People want to be in denial. My sense is that's where most of us are."
The three victims, who were not a part of Kauai's community, were sadly forgotten. Little has been written of them online, and that's why I think so many on the island were ready to move on. To them, they were three outsiders that were likely killed by another outsider, possibly an offender from the mainland visiting, or someone that was essentially banished from Kauai afterward. So their part in the story was over. It's never ended. The attacks they endured, that killed two of them, remain unsolved to this day, and the offender, the architect of these three women's misery, remains unidentified. A veteran firefighter from Kauai was quoted in the book KPD Blue, which came out roughly a decade after the murders. This firefighter spoke about the crimes of this unknown killer.
"When I'm working, it doesn't cross my mind, but when I go home and sit down and think about it, it really bothers me. Somewhere on this small island is someone who is very capable of very violent attacks on women, and it's probably someone many of us see every day."
As of this episode's recording, the stories of Lisa Bel, the surviving victim from May 2000, and Darren Singer remain unresolved. Thanks for listening, everybody. This episode was researched, written, hosted, and produced by myself, Micheal Whelan. The music throughout this episode was also composed by myself, except where noted in the show notes. I would now like to take a minute to thank the producers of this show, who support it each month on Patreon. Roberta Jansen, Sarah Moscaritolo, Ben Crocum, Scott Meesey, Marion Welsh, Jacinta Class, Lauren Nicole, James Weiss, Crystal J., Alex Kalaragopoulos, Annie Broad, Stephen Diaz, Riddis Bauza, Heather Fiddler, Anna T., and Brutalist. Thank you all so much for your support. And thank you to the rest of you patrons and supporters. It really does mean a lot. If you would like to become a producer or a patron, head on over to patreon.com/unresolvedpod to learn more. There you can get access to all kinds of bonus materials, including bonus episodes of Unresolved, as well as Resolved, the show where I tackle solved cases. You can also access some of those bonus episodes through Apple Podcast and Spotify, although the catalog there is still small but growing. Thank you all again for listening. I hope to be back again soon with another new episode, but until then, I hope you all stay safe, stay healthy, and I will talk to you again later. Bye.